A blood-curdling scream pierced the silence of the Arizona night, startling Rosalie Lawson awake from her fitful slumber. She bolted upright in her small bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched her swollen belly. The pains had begun. Her child was coming, and she was alone in her modest cabin on the outskirts of Ash Fork, Arizona Territory, 1883. "Lord help me," she whispered, gripping the bedsheets as another contraction tore through her. At 22 years old, Rosalie had never imagined she would be bringing a child into the world without a husband by her side. But Thomas, that sweet-talking railroad man, had disappeared back east 6 months ago, leaving nothing but empty promises and the growing life inside her. The labor was long and brutal. Hours passed as Rosalie fought through the pain alone, biting down on a folded piece of leather to keep from screaming again. As dawn broke across the desert landscape, a tiny cry finally joined her exhausted sobs. A daughter small but fierce, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the desert stars. "Hello, little one," Rosalie whispered, cradling the newborn to her chest. "It's just you and me now." The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and desperate days. Rosalie had enough money saved to last a month, maybe 2 if she was careful. She had been working as a seamstress in town until her condition became too obvious, forcing her into seclusion to avoid the judgmental stares and whispers. In Ash Fork, unmarried mothers were treated with a particular brand of cruelty that Rosalie wasn't prepared to face. On a crisp autumn morning, with her savings dwindling and her options few, Rosalie wrapped her month-old daughter in a handmade blanket and walked the mile into town. She needed work, and she needed it desperately. "I don't care what kind of help you need, Mr. Thompson," she pleaded with the general store owner. "I can clean, stock shelves, keep your books, anything." The older man's face softened with pity, but his eyes drifted to the bundle in her arms. "People talk, Miss Lawson. It's bad for business." The same response greeted her at the hotel, the laundry, and the dress shop. By midday, Rosalie sat on a bench outside the post office, fighting back tears as her daughter began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable. "Folks round here can be mighty narrow-minded," came a deep voice from beside her. Rosalie looked up to see a tall man leaning against the hitching post. He wasn't like the other men in town, no flashy clothing or city airs. His clothes were worn but clean, his face weathered by the sun and wind. A cowboy, she guessed, though not the rowdy type that caused trouble at the saloon on Saturday nights. "Xavier Montgomery," he said, tipping his hat. "I've got a small ranch about 5 miles north. Been looking for someone to help around the place." Rosalie clutched her baby tighter. "What kind of help?" "Cooking mostly. Some cleaning. Place is a mess since my mother passed last spring." His eyes, clear and blue as the Arizona sky, met hers without judgment. "There's a separate cabin where you and your little one could stay." It was a risk, Rosalie knew. A single woman living on a man's property would only feed the gossip mill, but the alternative, starvation or worse, left her little choice. "I'm Rosalie Lawson," she said finally, "and this is my daughter." Xavier's gaze softened as he looked at the infant. "She got a name?" Rosalie hesitated. She hadn't named her daughter yet, partly from exhaustion and partly from a foolish hope that Thomas might return and want some say. But that hope had died a little more each day. "Not yet," she admitted. "I've been calling her little one." Xavier nodded, not pressing further. "My wagon's over yonder. I can take you both out to see the place. If you don't like it, I'll bring you straight back to town." Rosalie considered her options for only a moment before nodding. "Let me gather my things. I don't have much." True to his word, Xavier's ranch was small but respectable, a modest main house, a barn with a corral, and a smaller cabin about 50 yards from the house. The land stretched for acres, dotted with scrubby vegetation and a small creek that seemed a miracle in the arid landscape. "It ain't much," Xavier said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but the land's paid for, and the cattle bring in enough." The cabin was simple, one room with a small stove, a bed, a table with 2 chairs and a rocking chair near the window. It was clean, if dusty from disuse. "My mother used to stay here when she visited," Xavier explained, "before she moved in with me permanent-like." Rosalie set her daughter on the bed, surrounded by blankets to keep her from rolling, though she was far too young for such feats. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Montgomery?" Xavier leaned against the doorframe, his hat in his hands. "I know what it's like to be alone, and—" he hesitated, something like sadness crossing his features. "I believe folks deserve second chances." That night, after settling into the cabin and feeding her daughter, Rosalie rocked in the chair by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The ranch was quiet, peaceful in a way Ash Fork had never been. Perhaps here, away from judging eyes, she could build something for herself and her child. The next morning, Rosalie walked to the main house, her daughter bundled against her chest. She found Xavier in the kitchen, his large hands awkwardly attempting to knead dough on a floured table. "You're doing it wrong," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Xavier looked up, flour dusting his dark beard. "Been trying to make bread for 3 days now. Keep ending up with something that could double as a horseshoe." Rosalie set her daughter in a basket lined with soft blankets and washed her hands. "Let me show you." She took over the dough, adding more flour and working it with practiced hands. Xavier watched, fascinated by the transformation under her fingers. "My mother taught me to bake when I was a girl," Rosalie explained. "Said a woman who could make good bread would never go hungry." "Wise woman," Xavier commented, leaning against the counter. His eyes drifted to the sleeping infant. "She needs a name, you know." "Can't go through life as little one." Rosalie's hands stilled in the dough. "I know, naming her makes it all so final, makes what final, that her father isn't coming back, that she's—" Rosalie swallowed hard, "that she has no father named." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Rosalie's surprise, he rolled up his sleeves and came to stand beside her at the table. His large hands covered hers as she worked the dough. "Like this?" he asked, his voice soft near her ear. Rosalie nodded, acutely aware of his closeness, of the gentle strength in his hands. Together, they kneaded the dough in silence until it was smooth and elastic. Xavier stepped back, looking at their handiwork with satisfaction. Then his eyes moved to the sleeping child. "She's got your nose," he observed, "and her father's stubbornness," Rosalie added with a sad smile. "Won't sleep unless she's good and ready," Xavier chuckled. "Sounds like someone who knows her own mind. That'll serve her well out here." He walked over to the basket and with surprising gentleness adjusted the blanket around the infant. The baby stirred, tiny fists waving in the air before settling again. Something in Xavier's expression shifted, softened. "My pa left when I was 4, he said quietly. "Don't remember much about him except my ma crying when he rode away. Grew up thinking I wasn't enough to make him stay." Rosalie felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm sorry." Xavier straightened, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "No child should grow up feeling unwanted. Your little one there." He nodded toward the basket. "She deserves better than that." The cowboy kneaded dough and said, "Call me Dad." The words hung in the air between them, a simple offer that carried the weight of a mountain. "Not now, not soon. But someday if you both stay, if that's something you want, I'd be honored." Rosalie's eyes widened. "Mr. Montgomery, Xavier," he corrected gently. "Xavier," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "You barely know us." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave. I know you love that child something fierce. And I know what it's like to grow up wondering why you weren't enough for your own father." Rosalie turned away, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. It was too much, too soon. "The bread needs to rise," she said, her voice unsteady. "I should see to my daughter." Xavier didn't press. He simply nodded, giving her the space she needed. "Dinner's at sundown if you'd care to join me." For the next few weeks, they fell into a cautious routine. Rosalie cooked and cleaned, mended Xavier's clothes, and slowly brought order to the chaos of his bachelor existence. Xavier worked from dawn to dusk with his small herd of cattle, repairing fences and tending to the endless tasks of a small ranch. They took meals together, their conversations growing easier with each passing day. And each day, Rosalie learned more about this quiet, thoughtful man who had opened his home to a desperate woman and her fatherless child. She learned that he read poetry by lamplight, that he could whistle any tune after hearing it once, that he treated his horses with more tenderness than most men showed their wives. October turned to November, bringing cooler temperatures to the Arizona territory. One evening, as the first frost threatened, Rosalie sat by the fire in Xavier's house, nursing her daughter while Xavier carved a small wooden horse. "I've been thinking about names," Rosalie said suddenly. Xavier looked up, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "Oh, I think I'll call her Hope." Rosalie stroked the baby's cheek, "because that's what she gave me when I had nothing else." Xavier's smile was warm, genuine. "Hope, it suits her." "Hope Lawson," Rosalie tested the name, then hesitated. "Or perhaps Hope Montgomery someday." Xavier's hand stilled completely. He set down his carving and knife, his eyes never leaving Rosalie's face. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm considering your offer," Rosalie clarified, her cheeks flushing. "Not for myself, but for Hope. She deserves a father who chooses her, not one who abandoned her before she drew her first breath." Xavier moved to kneel beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. "And what about you, Rosalie? What do you deserve?" The question caught her off guard. For so long she had thought only of survival of her child's needs. What did she deserve? Happiness? Love? Those seemed like luxuries beyond her reach. "I don't know," she answered honestly. Xavier reached out, his calloused finger gently tracing the curve of Hope's sleeping head. "I think you deserve someone who sees your strength, who admires your courage. Someone who will stand beside you, not because you need him to, but because he needs to be there." His eyes met hers, and Rosalie saw something there that made her heart beat faster. Not pity or obligation, but admiration. Perhaps even the beginnings of love. "I'm not asking for promises," Xavier continued. "Just time. Time for you to see that I mean what I say, that I'll be here for both of you, come what may." Rosalie nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a foundation upon which something real could grow. Winter descended on the Arizona territory with surprising ferocity that year. Snow blanketed the ranch in early December, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Rosalie had moved her things into the main house by then, though she maintained separate sleeping quarters. The cabin was too cold for an infant, Xavier had insisted, and Rosalie had agreed more readily than she cared to admit. Living under one roof brought new intimacies. They shared the warmth of the kitchen as Rosalie taught Xavier to cook simple meals. They sat before the fire in the evenings. Hope cradled between them as Xavier read aloud from his small collection of books. And slowly, cautiously, they began to touch a hand helping her down from a step, his fingers brushing hers as she passed him a cup of coffee, her palm against his forehead when he came in feverish from working in the snow. Christmas approached, and with it, a softening in Rosalie's guarded heart. She watched Xavier with hope, saw how gently he held her, how his face lit up when she grasped his finger in her tiny fist, how he rocked her and hummed old cowboy songs when she fussed. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Rosalie found Xavier in the kitchen, flour once again covering his hands and forearms. A small pile of misshapen biscuits sat on the table. "What are you doing?" she asked, amusement in her voice. Xavier looked up, embarrassed but determined. "Trying to make something special for Christmas dinner. Ma used to make these buttermilk biscuits that melted in your mouth." Rosalie approached, surveying his handiwork. "Your technique has improved, but you're working the dough too much. Biscuits need a gentle touch." She moved to stand beside him, taking some of the dough. Her hands worked quickly, demonstrating the proper technique. Xavier watched, then mimicked her movements with his own portion of dough. "Like this?" "Better," she encouraged. "But lighter. Imagine you're holding something precious, like hope." Xavier nodded, his hands becoming more confident as he worked. When their biscuits were cut and placed on the baking sheet, Rosalie couldn't help but laugh at the contrast, hers perfectly round and uniform, his slightly lopsided but earnestly made. "They'll taste the same," Xavier assured her with a grin. As they worked side by side, cleaning up the flour-dusted surfaces, Rosalie felt a contentment she hadn't known in years, perhaps ever. This simple domestic seen a man and woman preparing food, a baby sleeping peacefully in her cradle by the fire, felt like the family she had always wanted. "Rosalie," Xavier said suddenly, his voice serious, "there's something I need to tell you." Her hands stilled on the dishcloth. "What is it?" "I've been corresponding with the county judge about Hope." He wiped his hands on a towel, his movements deliberate, "about making her legally mine." Rosalie's breath caught. "You mean adoption?" Xavier nodded. "If you're agreeable. It would give her my name, make her my heir, protect her if—" He didn't finish the thought, but Rosalie understood. If something happened to her, Hope would still have a father, a home. But that would mean— Rosalie began. "It doesn't have to mean anything more than you want it to," Xavier assured her quickly. "We could continue as we are, or—" Rosalie prompted. When he fell silent, Xavier took a deep breath. "Or we could make it real, all of it. You, me, Hope. A family proper and true." Rosalie's heart thundered in her chest. "Are you asking me to marry you, Xavier Montgomery?" He stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. "I reckon I am. Not because it's proper or because it's expected, but because these past months with you and Hope have been the happiest of my life. Because I want to fall asleep each night knowing you'll be there in the morning. Because I want to teach Hope to ride and read and be strong like her mother." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I love you, Rosalie Lawson. And if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that love." Tears spilled down Rosalie's cheeks as she looked up at this man, this gentle, honorable man who had offered a home to a desperate woman and her fatherless child, who had never asked for anything in return, except the chance to love them both. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Xavier's face broke into a smile that could have lit the darkest night. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. When he set her down, his hands cradled her face as if she were made of the finest porcelain. "May I kiss you, Rosalie? I've been wanting to since the first day I saw you on that bench in town." In answer, Rosalie rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative with the newness of it. Then Xavier's arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth between them. They were married on New Year's Day, 1884, in a small ceremony at the ranch. Judge Wilson rode out from Prescott to perform the service, and a handful of Xavier's neighboring ranchers attended with their families. Rosalie wore a dress of deep blue that Xavier had ordered from a catalog, and Hope, now 3 months old, was dressed in a white gown that Rosalie had sewn from one of Xavier's best shirts. As they stood before the judge, exchanging simple vows and plain gold bands, Rosalie felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself as a young girl dreaming of romance, but it was better, deeper, truer, built on respect and understanding rather than fleeting passion. After the simple celebration, when their guests had departed and Hope was sleeping soundly, Xavier led Rosalie to the bedroom they would now share. He had added a woman's dressing table, a larger wardrobe, and fresh curtains that Rosalie recognized from the general store in town. "When did you do all this?" she asked, touching the polished surface of the dressing table. "Been working on it bit by bit," Xavier admitted, a hint of shyness in his voice. "Wanted it to feel like your room too, not just mine." Rosalie turned to her husband, and saw in his eyes a mixture of desire and uncertainty that matched her own. They had known each other only a few months, had moved from strangers to spouses with a speed that would have scandalized proper society. Yet there was nothing hurried or improper in the way Xavier looked at her now, as if they had all the time in the world. "Come here," she said softly, holding out her hand. Xavier took it, allowing her to draw him closer. This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation, no holding back. His hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress, and Rosalie closed her eyes, surrendering to the tender ministrations of the man who had chosen to be hers. Spring came early to Arizona that year, turning the desert around Ash Fork into a brief wonderland of wildflowers and green grass. Hope grew stronger each day, her eyes the same clear blue as Xavier's, though neither Rosalie nor Xavier commented on the coincidence, taking in the world with increasing awareness. Xavier doted on her, carrying her with him around the ranch when his tasks allowed, speaking to her as if she understood every word. "See there, Hope, that's a red-tailed hawk, and over yonder, those are your pa's cattle. Someday this will all be yours." Rosalie watched them from the doorway of the house, her heart so full it sometimes frightened her. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this content. Yet shadows still lurked at the edges of her joy. The specter of Thomas, Hope's biological father, haunted her quieter moments. Would he return someday? Would he try to claim the child he had abandoned? These fears she kept to herself, not wanting to taint the happiness she and Xavier had found. But one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope asleep in her cradle beside them, Xavier took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Something's troubling you," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Has been for a while now." Rosalie sighed. She should have known she couldn't hide her feelings from this man who had become so attuned to her moods. "I worry about Thomas," she admitted, "about him coming back someday." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "The railroad man." Rosalie nodded. "What if he returns? What if he wants to see Hope?" Xavier's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Hope is my daughter now in every way that matters. The law says so, and more importantly, my heart says so." He turned to face her fully. "But if he comes back, we'll face that together, like we do everything else." His certainty, his unwavering commitment, eased the knot of anxiety in Rosalie's chest. "I love you," she said simply. Xavier's smile was tender as he leaned over to kiss her. "And I love you, Mrs. Montgomery." Summer brought scorching heat, and the busiest season on the ranch. Xavier hired 2 young cowboys to help with the herd, and Rosalie found herself cooking for 4 hungry men instead of just 1. She didn't mind the extra hands meant Xavier could spend more time at home. And the cowboys, brothers named Joseph and Matthew, were respectful and grateful for her cooking. One sweltering July afternoon, as Rosalie was hanging laundry with Hope nearby on a blanket, she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were rare at the ranch, especially in the heat of summer. She shielded her eyes, watching as the wagon drew closer, driven by a man she didn't recognize. Xavier emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he moved to intercept the visitor. Rosalie gathered Hope, now 8 months old and attempting to crawl, and moved closer to the house, a sense of unease prickling at her skin. The man who stepped down from the wagon was well dressed, his suit out of place in the dusty yard. He removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and a face that sent a jolt of recognition through Rosalie. Thomas. She froze, clutching Hope tighter against her chest as Xavier and Thomas spoke. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the tension in Xavier's stance, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides before deliberately relaxing. Then both men turned toward her, and Rosalie knew she couldn't avoid this confrontation. With her head held high, she walked forward to meet them, Hope babbling happily in her arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. "Rosalie," Thomas said, his voice just as she remembered it, smooth and cultured, with that Eastern accent that had once seemed so sophisticated. "You're looking well." "Thomas," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "What brings you to Arizona?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I heard about the child, our child." His eyes moved to Hope, widening slightly as he took in her features. "I wanted to see her." Xavier moved to stand beside Rosalie, his presence solid and reassuring. "Hope is our daughter," he said firmly. "Mine and Rosalie's, legal and proper." Thomas's expression hardened. "I have rights. You gave up any rights when you abandoned Rosalie," Xavier cut in, his voice low but intense. "When you left her alone and with child." Thomas flushed, anger and embarrassment warring on his face. "I didn't know she was expecting. I had obligations back east, family matters, obligations more important than the woman you claimed to love," Rosalie interjected, finding her voice at last. "More important than the child you created." Thomas had no answer for that. He looked at Hope again, who was regarding him with solemn curiosity. "She has my mother's eyes," he said softly. "She has her own eyes," Xavier corrected. "And she has a father who loves her, who's here for her every day, who will teach her to ride and shoot and be proud of who she is." Thomas's gaze shifted between them, taking in the united front they presented. Something in his expression changed, a realization dawning. "You love him," he said to Rosalie, not an accusation but a statement of fact. "Yes," Rosalie replied without hesitation. "I love my husband. We're a family, Thomas, Hope, Xavier, and me." Thomas nodded slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "I see that now." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I came to offer support, money for the child's upbringing. But I can see she doesn't lack for anything." "Keep your money," Xavier said. "We don't need it." Thomas hesitated, then returned the envelope to his pocket. "I'm returning east tomorrow, getting married next month to a lady from Boston." He looked at Hope one last time. "She's beautiful, Rosalie. I'm glad she has a good home." With that, he climbed back into his wagon and turned it around, heading back toward town without looking back. Rosalie watched him go, a strange mixture of emotions churning within her: relief, closure, and an unexpected sense of pity for the man who would never know the joy of his daughter's laughter. Her first steps, her first words. Xavier's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Rosalie nodded, looking up at the man who had given her and Hope so much more than a home. "I am now." That night, after Hope was asleep, Xavier and Rosalie sat at their kitchen table, cups of coffee growing cold between them. I half expected him to fight for her, Rosalie admitted, to demand some claim on her. Xavier shook his head. Men like that don't fight for what matters. They take what's easy and leave when things get hard. He reached across the table, taking her hand. But I want you to know, if he had fought, if he had tried to take her from us, I would have moved heaven and earth to keep our family together. I know, Rosalie said, squeezing his hand. That's why I love you. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Rosalie traced the contours of Xavier's face with her fingertips. Do you ever regret it? She whispered. Taking us in, making us your family. Xavier caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Not for a single moment. You and Hope, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in the darkness. And as Rosalie surrendered to her husband's embrace, she knew with absolute certainty that the family they had created not by blood but by choice, by love, by daily acts of devotion, was stronger than any accident of birth could ever be. Autumn brought change to the Montgomery ranch. Xavier's cattle business had prospered enough that he could hire a permanent foreman, allowing him more time at home. Hope was walking now, her chubby legs carrying her determinedly across the yard, usually in pursuit of the ranch's cats or Xavier's heels. And Rosalie had news of her own, a secret she had confirmed with the doctor in Ash Fork, before sharing it with Xavier on a crisp October evening. They sat on their porch swing, Hope already asleep inside, the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Xavier, she began, her heart fluttering with nervous excitement. Do you remember when we first met? When you found me on that bench in town? He smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Best day of my life, though I didn't know it then. You offered me and Hope a home when no one else would, Rosalie continued. You chose to be her father when her own flesh and blood abandoned her. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat, Xavier assured her. Rosalie took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. Well, it seems you'll have another little one to father come spring. Xavier's eyes widened, his hand pressing more firmly against her still flat abdomen. You're sure? Rosalie nodded, tears of happiness brimming in her eyes. Dr. Fletcher confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Xavier. With a whoop that probably startled the cattle in the distant pasture, Xavier lifted Rosalie from the swing and spun her around, his face alight with joy. When he set her down, his hands cradled her face with infinite tenderness. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For making me the happiest man in the Arizona Territory, for giving me a family I never thought I'd have. Rosalie leaned into his touch, her heart full to bursting. You're the one who gave us everything, Xavier. A home, a name, a future. They stood together in the gathering dusk, arms wrapped around each other, dreaming of the spring that would bring new life to their family. And in that moment, Rosalie knew that the difficult path that had led her to Ash Fork, to that bench where Xavier Montgomery had found her, had been leading her home all along. The winter of 1884-1885 was milder than the previous year, allowing Xavier to complete several projects around the ranch before Rosalie's confinement. He built a proper nursery adjoining their bedroom, with 2 small beds, one for Hope and one for the coming baby. He expanded the kitchen, adding more cupboards and a larger table where their growing family could gather for meals. And with the help of his ranch hands, he constructed a proper corral where Hope could learn to ride when she was old enough. Rosalie blossomed in her pregnancy. Where her first experience had been shadowed by fear and uncertainty, this time she was surrounded by love and support. Xavier doted on her, insisting she rest when she tired, bringing her wild strawberries from the creek bed because she mentioned craving them, reading to her and Hope in the evenings by the fire. Hope, now a toddler with a vocabulary that expanded daily, seemed to understand that something important was happening. She patted Rosalie's growing belly, saying "baby" with solemn certainty. And she had taken to calling Xavier Dada without any prompting, a development that brought tears to his eyes the first time he heard it, on a mild March evening as the desert began to bloom with early wildflowers. Rosalie went into labor. This time, she wasn't alone. Xavier rode for the midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, who lived on a neighboring ranch, while the foreman's wife, Sarah, stayed with Rosalie and kept Hope occupied. The labor was shorter than her first, but no less intense. Xavier paced outside their bedroom, flinching at each of Rosalie's cries until Mrs. Abernathy finally called him in to meet his child, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's strong jawline. "A son," Xavier breathed, his voice filled with wonder as Mrs. Abernathy placed the swaddled infant in his arms. "Rosalie, we have a son." Rosalie, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at her husband. "What shall we name him?" Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, holding their son where Rosalie could see him. "I thought perhaps we might name him after my father," he said hesitantly. "Not because I hold any great affection for the man, but because I want our son to know that names and blood don't make a father. Love does. Showing up every day does." Rosalie reached out to touch her son's tiny hand. "What was your father's name?" "Daniel," Xavier replied. "Daniel Montgomery." "Daniel," Rosalie repeated, testing the name. "It's a strong name, a good name for a boy who will grow up knowing what it means to be truly fathered." Xavier leaned down to kiss her forehead, then her lips. "Thank you," he whispered, "for our children, for our life together, for everything." The door creaked open and Hope toddled in, Sarah close behind with an apologetic expression. "Sorry, she insisted on seeing her mama." "It's all right," Rosalie said, holding out her free arm to her daughter. "Come meet your brother, Hope." Xavier lifted the little girl onto the bed, supporting her as she peered curiously at the newborn. "Baby," she said decisively, reaching out to touch his cheek with surprising gentleness. "Yes, sweetheart," Xavier confirmed. "This is Daniel, your little brother." Hope looked up at Xavier, her blue eyes serious. "Dada baby," Xavier's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, Hope, Dada's baby, and yours too." The family of four huddled together on the bed, a tableau of happiness that would have seemed impossible to Rosalie just 18 months before, when she sat alone and afraid on a bench in Ash Fork. As spring turned to summer, life settled into a new rhythm at the Montgomery Ranch. Daniel proved to be an easy baby, content to sleep in his cradle or in the sling Rosalie fashioned to carry him as she went about her daily tasks. Hope was a doting big sister, bringing her toys to share with Daniel and patting his head whenever she passed his cradle. Xavier's cattle business continued to prosper, allowing him to hire more help and spend more time with his family. He took particular delight in teaching Hope about ranch life, lifting her onto his shoulders to see inside birds' nests, showing her how to feed the chickens, letting her help when he needed dough for Rosalie's bread recipe he was still determined to master. One warm afternoon, as Rosalie sat on the porch nursing Daniel, she watched Xavier and Hope in the yard. Xavier had set up a small table and was working a batch of dough, Hope standing on a crate beside him, her small hands covered in flour as she mimicked his movements. "Like this, Dada?" Hope asked, her face scrunched in concentration as she pushed at the dough. "Just like that, sweetheart," Xavier encouraged, his own hands working beside hers. "You're a natural, just like your mama." Hope beamed at the praise, then looked over at Rosalie. "Mama, I make bread." "I see that, darling," Rosalie called back, adjusting Daniel at her breast. "You're doing a wonderful job." Xavier caught Rosalie's eye over Hope's head, his expression so full of love it made her heart ache. This was the life she had always wanted but never dared hope for: a loving husband, beautiful children, a home filled with laughter and warmth. Later that evening, after both children were asleep, Xavier and Rosalie sat on their porch swing, watching as the desert sky filled with stars. Xavier's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, their bodies fitting together with the comfortable familiarity of true partners. "I had a letter from Judge Wilson today," Xavier said, his deep voice rumbling against her ear. "Thomas has formally relinquished any claim to Hope. She's legally ours now in every way." Rosalie sighed with relief. Though Thomas had not returned since his visit the previous summer, the possibility had lingered in the back of her mind. "That's wonderful news." Xavier nodded, his hand stroking her arm absently. "I've been thinking about something else too, about the future." "Oh," Rosalie lifted her head to look at him. "The railroad's coming through Ash Fork next year," Xavier explained. "It'll change things. More people, more opportunities. I've been offered a good price for some of my land, the section nearest town. Enough to expand the house, maybe build a proper ranch house with more rooms for the children as they grow." Rosalie considered this. The ranch house was comfortable but small, and with 2 children now, space was becoming a consideration. "That sounds sensible. The children will need room to grow." Xavier smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And maybe room for more children if you wanted." The question was tentative, almost shy. They had never discussed how large they wanted their family to be, the whirlwind of their courtship and marriage followed by Hope and Daniel leaving little time for such planning. Rosalie turned in his arms, her hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek. "I would like that," she said softly. "More little Montgomerys running around this ranch, though perhaps we might wait until Daniel is walking before we think about another." Xavier chuckled, turning his head to kiss her palm. "That seems reasonable." His expression grew more serious. "I want to give you everything, Rosalie. Everything you and our children could ever need or want." "We already have everything that matters," Rosalie assured him, leaning up to press her lips to his. "We have each other. We have a home filled with love. What more could anyone want?" As their kiss deepened under the star-filled Arizona sky, Rosalie marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a desperate young woman with a newborn and no prospects, to a beloved wife and mother, mistress of a prospering ranch, surrounded by a family created through choice and love rather than mere circumstance. And at the center of it all was Xavier, the man who had seen her strength when she felt most vulnerable, who had offered a home to a child with no father named, who had kneaded dough beside a little girl and said, "Call me Dad," with his actions every day since. In the years that followed, the Montgomery Ranch flourished along with its family. The railroad did indeed come to Ash Fork, bringing growth and prosperity to the small town. Xavier sold part of his land at a handsome profit and built a spacious ranch house with bedrooms for each of the children, a proper study for himself, and a bright, airy kitchen where Rosalie continued to teach her growing brood the art of baking bread. Hope grew into a confident young girl with her mother's grace and her father's steady resolve. She showed a natural affinity for horses, spending hours in the stables with Xavier, learning to ride and care for the animals. By the time she was 10, she could outride most of the ranch hands, a fact that filled Xavier with unmistakable pride. Daniel became his father's shadow, tagging along on ranch business from the time he could walk, soaking up knowledge of cattle and land management like a sponge. He had Xavier's thoughtful nature, but Rosalie's quick smile, a combination that made him a favorite with everyone who knew him. And there were more children: a daughter, Clara, born in 1887, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and twin boys, Joseph and William, who arrived in 1890, bringing both chaos and boundless joy to the Montgomery household. Through it all, Xavier and Rosalie's love deepened and matured, their partnership strengthened by each challenge they faced together, each joy they shared. They became pillars of the growing Ash Fork community, Xavier serving on the town council, Rosalie organizing aid for families in need, their home always open to neighbors and travelers alike. On Hope's 16th birthday in 1899, the Montgomerys hosted a celebration that brought together the entire community. The ranch yard was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, tables laden with food prepared by Rosalie and her daughters, music provided by local musicians including Daniel on the fiddle Xavier had taught him to play. As twilight fell and the festivities continued around them, Xavier found Rosalie standing at the edge of the gathering, watching their children with a contented smile. Hope was teaching some of the younger children a dance, her laughter carrying across the yard. Daniel was deep in conversation with the banker's son about cattle prices. Clara was helping serve pie, and the twins were, as usual, in the middle of whatever mischief was brewing among the youngsters. Xavier slipped his arm around Rosalie's waist, drawing her close against his side. At 45, he was still strong and vital, though silver now threaded his dark hair and beard. Rosalie, at 39, had lost none of her beauty in his eyes, the years only adding depth and character to her lovely face. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Montgomery," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Rosalie leaned into his embrace, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested at her waist. "I was just thinking about how fortunate we are. Look at them, Xavier. Look at what we've built together." Xavier followed her gaze, taking in their 5 children, each unique, each beloved, each a testament to the family they had created. "We've been blessed," he agreed. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Rosalie turned in his arms, her hands moving to frame his face, her eyes searching his. "Do you ever regret it? That day in town when you offered a home to a desperate woman and her fatherless child?" Xavier's hands covered hers, his expression solemn. "Not for a single moment. That was the day my life truly began, Rosalie, the day I found my purpose, my heart." Tears shimmered in Rosalie's eyes as she smiled up at him. "I love you, Xavier Montgomery. I have from almost the first, though I was too afraid to admit it then." "And I've loved you just as long," Xavier replied, his voice husky with emotion. "From the moment I saw you on that bench, trying so hard to be brave for your little one. I knew then that you were the strongest, most beautiful woman I'd ever meet." Their lips met in a kiss that held the memory of every kiss that had come before, from the tentative first touch on the day of Xavier's proposal to the passionate embraces of their wedding night, from the joyous celebrations at each child's birth to the quiet comfort they offered each other in times of hardship. A lifetime of love, contained in a single perfect moment. A chorus of good-natured teasing from their children broke them apart, both laughing as Hope called out, "Ma, Pa, there are children present." Xavier winked at his eldest daughter. "Just showing you youngsters how it's done," he called back, pulling Rosalie closer as their children groaned in mock horror. Later that night, when the guests had departed and the younger children were asleep, Xavier and Rosalie sat on the porch of their home, just as they had so many nights before. Hope joined them briefly, kissing them both good night before retiring to her room, her birthday gifts clutched in her arms. "She looks more like you every day," Xavier observed as Hope disappeared inside. "She has your strength, your compassion, and your stubbornness," Rosalie added with a smile, "your sense of justice." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band he had placed there 16 years before. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you asked earlier if I ever regretted taking you and Hope in." Rosalie squeezed his hand. "I shouldn't have asked. I know the answer." "No, it's a fair question. But I realized something tonight. I didn't take you in, Rosalie. You and Hope. You saved me. I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions of living. You gave me a reason to build something, to be something better than I was." Tears welled in Rosalie's eyes as she leaned against his shoulder. "We saved each other then." Xavier nodded, his arm encircling her shoulders. "That's what family does. Real family, the kind that chooses each other every day, the kind we've built here." As they sat together in the soft Arizona night, surrounded by the home they had created, Rosalie reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate young woman with a nameless baby to the matriarch of a thriving family. From a lonely cowboy to a respected rancher and devoted father of 5. And through it all, the thread that had bound them together, not blood or obligation, but love. The love of a man who had seen a child with no father named, who had kneaded dough beside her and said, "Call me Dad." The love that had built a family, a legacy, a life worth living. "Come inside, my love," Xavier said softly, rising and offering his hand. "Tomorrow's a new day." Rosalie placed her hand in his as she had done countless times before, as she would do countless times to come. "And we'll face it together," she said, "as we always have." Hand in hand, they walked into the home they had built, their love a beacon that would guide their family for generations to come.